Well, hello there. Exams are a vexed period of time for anyone, or for most people anyway. I want to try and take some of the vexation out by explaining a few of the things we're looking for in out of the essay that you're being invited to write for the exam in Anthropology 1002, Global Change, Local Responses. Let me share the screen with you. Let me share a series of slides. And I presume you've got those there in front of you now. Let's just go through as quickly as I can some of the things we're doing. The exam will be available, as explained, I believe already, through your LMS, your local management system, your online management system. So you will not be going into an exam room to do the multiple choice questions or write the essay. You'll be doing that somehow, somewhere from the comfort of a place of your choosing. 25 multiple choice questions, suggested time 40 minutes, 30% of total. And that will be available throughout the exam. We're not going to time the multiple choice section. We'll give you the time to do that, but you need to be disciplined with it. Don't spend more time there than you should. Get to the essay, which is worth 70% of the total. Suggested time there is 80 minutes in the 2-hour exam. The task, broadly sketched, involves applying the sociological imagination to 3 identified topics. You choose 2 from weeks 1 to 9 of some of the material we've done: commodity production and trade, coffee, corn, copper in Zambia, wheat, etc. And of course, some of you have already looked at other commodities, stuff that you've researched, perfectly legitimate to use here. The world before her is a more specific aspect of the unit, but you're certainly welcome to use that. The case studies that come out of that. Global music scenes is an area where quite a few of you have done some extra research that you may want to bring into play. Migration in the US and Australia, and again, some of you have done research, particularly in the Australian context, of the experiences of different groups of migrants here. Choose 2 of those, and then 1 from the more recent explorations that we've done that are picking up some of the contemporary matters of our time in this particular decade. Inequality and COVID-19. What does the recent experiences there tell us? Black Lives Matter, global warming, heating, as some are starting to call it, I've noticed. Warming seems too gentle. These case studies, what you're being asked to do to it is apply Christian's global critical race and racism framework that was discussed in week 11 to analyze the extent to which this helps explain the personal issues and problems faced by people in a structural context. It is a very structural essay, no question about that, and we'll come to some of the issues around that through this presentation. In explaining the sociological imagination, we want you to understand the relationship between self and society. One of the catchphrases that comes out of an understanding of sociological imagination is understanding that personal problems are social issues. And if you are very much somebody who holds to the sociological imagination as a truism, you will say that personal problems, personal triumphs also, are social issues. You don't get to university just by yourself. It takes a system to help you get there. And there are systemic ways in which people are encouraged or discouraged from getting to a place like this. The relationship between the individual experience and the wider society is an important element of understanding the sociological imagination. But how wide should this be applied? To what extent are what we're talking about here local phenomena? To what extent should we be thinking about it in terms of what the nation state does, the ways in which that's organized and impacts on people? And to what extent is there a global system at play? And this is really where we get to the nub of, the heart of Christian's argument. And it's worth always asking yourself in this regard, in trying to understand the sociological imagination, to what extent are the issues you face as a student, as a worker, as a youngish person, a woman, man, or other, as a person in all of your complex glory, what extent are the issues you face triggered by global events and matters? To what extent is your life affected by globalized structures? So are the issues you face perhaps more attributable to the nation in which you live or to your local community? Or in the end, are they down to you? Are you somebody who doesn't really buy into this sociological imaginary? You'd sooner be dealing with much more realistic issues. Ultimately, it's up to the individual. That's also obviously a legitimate perspective. It's out there. Sociologically, I believe it's a nonsense, the idea of a self-made person, but it's there to be argued. The case is to be argued, and if it's argued well, I certainly would like to think that we should be able to tolerate, deal with, allow, legitimize these perspectives, because they are all part of the complex glory of the society in which we live. Anywhere in the world, if we start to think about it in its global context, to what extent are the issues faced by others anywhere in the world triggered by global events and matters? Getting back to the question just asked. And here are some of the examples here that we've been dealing with through this unit. And of course, you're now being asked to pick up 3 of those as case studies. Now, when it comes to Christian's argument, it's a complicated paper. But I think this diagram is where we should be focused. And you should be able, I believe, to internalize this, to have an idea about this particular structure, to be able to reproduce it perhaps would be helpful. And what Christian makes the point is that, 20 years ago or so ago, we had an injection of ideas built around systemic racism. So the model was built pretty much around this, that there are racist structures and racist ideas, ideologies, the structures of the state, the economic structures in place, the institutional structures that are all interwoven, that are also guided by and impact on and influence the ways in which we talk about these things, the discourses of as the society, and the ways in which racialized people are represented, or the ways in which people are represented often in racialized ways, thought about in that way, and the impacts that these have. Okay, so this is the idea of structural racism, how that works, how that impacts on people. And what Christian argues is a bit of a problem, or a bit of a roadblock, a cul-de-sac in this way of thinking, is it tends to be applied into national systems, and also tends to ignore race in favor of ethnicity, which is all part of a broader history of the development of the ideas around race. But she would argue, ultimately it comes back to race. She, in saying, well, we need to think about this in a global system, as you've probably picked up, a world system of white supremacy. She adds on to then this structure, she adds on history, understanding the colonial history and its impact, its lingering impacts on so many parts of the world. And then the more recent developments that are often called global, particularly in terms of neoliberal change, and we can think particularly in the context of this unit in terms of structural adjustment, which you may recall from Thompson and Smith's paper was very much focused, Thompson Jones I think it was actually, focused on Western Australian wheat belt, but implies that structural adjustment wasn't just applied into the global south, whereas Australia, but also into the Australian context as well. So this is about understanding how we can start to think about a global system of racialized structures, racialized discourses, and how that works for us. So that really, and that's the nutshell of her argument. And I think if you can find ways of working this through into your case studies, that's really what you're being called to do, and to think about it in those particular ways. When it comes to assessing the model, well, the strengths of such a strongly structural model, and there's no doubt about that, is that it helps illuminate the structures of domination and oppression that can go unnoticed, particularly if one holds the view that, well, it's up to the individual, or we tend to see the world through those individualized lens, through the lens of the individual, understanding it in that way. It helps explain inequalities beyond individual cases. So it's a means of applying the sociological imagination, in this case on a global scale, recognizing as we do so the global processes and forces and their role in shaping social life. So to what extent is your life, is my life, are our lives impacted by global structures, global ideologies. There may be other aspects of this that you want to bring in as a strength, but they certainly do as a list at this stage. The challenges of the model, of the framework, as the structural determinist arguments that have been highlighted earlier in this unit. So there's a tendency where structures determine human behavior. They become the cause and trigger of everything that goes on. And it gives people no way, it often doesn't allow for the agency, the ways in which people respond and react and make structures. And some of you in my tutorials will have heard me quote the well-known Bourdieuian quote, that the structuring structures are structured structures. Let me say that again. Structuring structures are structured structures. Understanding that structures do things to us, we do things to structures. There's a dynamic interplay going on. This can sometimes get ignored in such strongly structural arguments. What Christian is doing in some ways is objecting to those who tend to see the world as just being structured by human beings and not understanding the ways in which structures rub up against people as well. There are always exceptions in the universalizing frame, and what you have to make decisions about there is, do those exceptions start to undermine the ideas, or do you hold to a view that the exceptions simply prove the rule? Yes, sure, there are going to be some. Don't expect it to hold for everything. But as a general rule, this is how the world works. They often miss the subtle and not so subtle differences across the globe and the degrees of causality. And Christian gets to this in the final pages of her paper, where she says that we more or less, I think, puts forward an idea that we have to think about it in terms of it being more or less racist, or about race when we start to look at individual case studies. And of course, that's what you're being invited to do. What this then really overlaps into is intersectionality, and she does certainly raise this issue without resolving it in any way. Her argument and her role, I think, in this particular paper is to put forward the case for race to be the most significant contributor, the most significant factor in explaining the inequalities of the world in which we live in this globalized period. But there are other causes. And she concedes patriarchy in her paper as being significant, so gender as a big issue. She doesn't mention social class, but that has to be there. I mean, the experiences of wealthy people, regardless of color, can be very similar and quite different to those experiences of people living in poverty, regardless of color. So they're some of the things that need to be weighed up in assessing these arguments. Disability often doesn't get a run in this, but it's always worth thinking about the extent to which that is also an aspect of this. The degree to which able-bodiedness is another part of a structuring force in lives and in life opportunities. The framing of resistance is another element of this. It's a model that's not making allowances for that, the ways in which change actually can happen. That can get back to the notion of determinism. It keeps driving towards bad outcomes, but change is possible, and how that fits within the framing of this. And change is always happening is the other element of this. Now, resistance is an interesting idea. That's often where people who follow a more critical line tend to see agency as forms of resistance. I think a practice theory where structuring structures are structured structures would tend to think about agency as something that is where agency can also be found in compliance, in going along with systems, not just in resisting them, in making them work for you in your own in different ways, can be one of the things that we could be thinking about there. Allowing those structuring structures to enable us to improve our life chances. Okay, so what I'm really just trying to get at there then, if I go back, I'll just go back up to this. Here's some of the strengths. Here's some of the challenges of theories like this. And what you've got to do is a process of weighing up through this essay how you think this goes. When it comes to actually structuring the essay, I recommend the following structure quite strongly. That you do an introduction where you explain those two key terms, the sociological imagination and Christian's global critical race and racism framework. that there are 3 case studies to consider, and you need to decide which ones you're going to work with. And I suggest that you lay them out individually. Use headings to do it, and sort of signaling the move through it, but just lay out these case studies, give some background to them, and then start to think about how they fit or don't fit within the framework that you're analysing here. Then when you finish laying out the case studies and laying out the case for and against in some ways, come to the synthesis and discussion, drawing out the similarities and the contrasts and assessing the model, assessing the framework that Christian offers us. So that gets us into that section, and then we come to the conclusion and we start to ask ourselves then, how useful is Christian's framework? How well does it explain the effects of globalization? Emphasis? Well, these numbers here, 5, 10, 20, are indicating, if you count them up, you'll see that they'll come to 100. And they're the guides that I will use in assessing the exam essay. So how well is this explained? How well are these 2 concepts explained? How well do these case studies come out? And then comes, how well do you do the analysis of what these things tell us and how useful, and then in the end there, just a brief conclusion that starts to allow you to deal with, that just allows you to draw some conclusion to your essay. And but the most important sections you can see lie in doing the case studies and that synthesis and discussion. You do also need to set up your argument well enough for the essay to really work for you. But I think if you can do it in this systematic kind of a way, I think you can start to do what this exam essay is aimed to do, is to allow you to show that you have been involved in this unit, you've taken in the ideas that are there, and that you are able to do critical analysis of the ideas. And of course, in this case, it's critical analysis of critical analysis, a kind of meta-critique, if you like, that you're being invited to take part in. So go well with that. Good luck with it. I hope it goes well for you. You know where to find me if you want to ask me any further questions. And I'll see some of you at the workshop where we will start to process this material still further. Thanks very much for that.